Monster wing inside the prison where even guards are afraid. The alarm didn't ring, it screamed. A sharp, metallic howl tore through the concrete corridors just after midnight. Red emergency lights began to pulse, washing the cell block in a blood-tinted glow. Inside the control booth, officers froze for half a second before training took over. Every monitor on the wall flickered to the same range, the most restricted tier in the entire prison. Monster wing. A place so feared that even veteran correctional officers spoke about it in lowered voices. Camera 6 showed the first sign of movement. An inmate stood at the back of his cell, completely still, except for his hands. He was holding something. Small. Metallic. Sharpened. Improvised. Forbidden. Deadly. The officer zoomed in. The man's eyes didn't blink. He was breathing slowly, calmly, like someone who had already made peace with what he was about to do. Then the cell door slot slammed open from the inside. Not fully, just enough for an arm to force through. The inmate lunged. Steel struck steel as the weapon jammed into the narrow food port, stabbing blindly toward the officer making rounds. The guard stumbled backward, radio crashing to the floor as backup alarms detonated across the unit. Code red. Monster wing. Officer under attack. Boots thundered down the tier. Riot shields. Pepper spray. Shock batons. But no one rushed the door immediately. Because everyone knew who was inside that cell. This wasn't a desperate first-timer, or a panicked young offender. This was one of the most dangerous men ever placed in federal custody, an inmate whose violence had already reshaped how America ran its prisons. As the emergency response team stacked outside the steel door, the inmate began to laugh. Slow. Controlled. Echoing through the concrete like it belonged there. And in that moment, every officer on the tier understood the truth that training manuals never said out loud. Monster wing didn't just house violence. It bred it. The standoff that night would become one of the most studied Supermax incidents in modern correctional history. But to understand how it reached that point, you have to go back years earlier. Back to the man in the cell. Back to the killings that made prison officials build entire policies around a single inmate. Back to the moment authorities realized that putting monsters together in one place might create something even worse. Because the prisoner who launched that midnight attack wasn't always locked behind the most secure door in America. Once, he walked prison yards like everyone else. Until the day he proved he couldn't be contained. Years before the alarm ever screamed inside Monster Wing, the inmate at the center of the midnight attack had already built a reputation that followed him through every facility he entered. He was serving multiple life sentences in the federal system, convicted of violent armed robberies and the murders that happened during them. Court records described him as controlled, intelligent, and extremely dangerous under stress. Prosecutors argued he treated violence like a tool, something he used when it benefited him. His first years behind bars were spent in high-security penitentiaries, but not yet in total isolation. At first, he kept a low profile. He worked prison jobs. Spoke little. Studied staff routines. Other inmates later said he watched everything. Who walked where, what time doors opened, which officers cut corners. Then the first incident happened. A routine movement between cell blocks turned into a coordinated assault. Homemade weapons were pulled. An officer was overpowered. Surveillance later showed the inmate didn't throw the first strike, but he finished it. Calmly. Efficiently. Like he'd rehearsed it. He was transferred within weeks. Higher security. Less freedom. More monitoring. But the violence followed. At the next facility, he became involved in organized inmate operations, controlling contraband flow, enforcing debts, punishing rule violations. Staff intelligence reports flagged him as a tier influencer, someone who could order violence without touching anyone himself. Then came the incident that changed everything. During a lockdown search, officers discovered hidden weapons inside a ventilation shaft near his cell. Sharpened metal. Modified handles. Enough to arm multiple inmates. Investigators believed the stash was meant for a coordinated uprising. He was placed in solitary confinement pending review. 23 hours a day inside a concrete box. No yard contact. No group movement. Most inmates deteriorate quietly under those conditions. He didn't. Instead, his behavior grew more calculated. He flooded his cell repeatedly to force officer entry, covered cameras, refused restraints. Each action designed to test response times, procedures, weaknesses. Psychological evaluations noted rising hostility, but also patience. He wasn't breaking. He was studying. Within a year, federal authorities made a decision reserved for only the most uncontrollable prisoners. He was transferred to the nation's most restrictive Supermax environment, a unit informally known by staff as Monster Wing, a place built specifically for inmates too dangerous for any other prison to manage. When he arrived, even veteran officers read his file twice. Because by then, it was already clear. Isolation hadn't reduced the threat. It had concentrated it. And inside Monster Wing, there would be nothing left to contain it but steel doors and fear. The transfer to Monster Wing happened before sunrise. No public schedule. No standard transport chain. Movements like this were classified, handled with the same secrecy used for terrorism suspects and cartel leaders. The inmate was shackled at the wrists, waist, and ankles. Black box restraints locked over the cuffs to prevent movement. A stun device was attached to his leg irons, a last resort measure if he resisted. Even then, the escort team moved cautiously. Because Monster Wing wasn't just another housing unit. It was a prison inside the prison. Concrete corridors with no natural light. Reinforced doors layered with electronic and mechanical locks. Cameras positioned so there were no blind spots, at least, none that staff knew of. Inmates there spent 23 hours a day alone. No group yard. No shared meals. No physical contact. Human interaction happened through thick glass and narrow food ports. When he entered the tier for the first time, officers noticed something unsettling. He wasn't angry. He was observing. His eyes moved slowly, counting doors, cameras, response posts. Studying like he had at every facility before. But Monster Wing had a different effect on people. Weeks turned into months. Silence replaced noise. The only sounds were boots, keys, and distant screams from inmates unraveling under isolation. Psychological reports documented the change. Sleep disruption. Extended pacing. Talking to himself. Then, long periods of absolute stillness. Officers said he would stand at the back of his cell for hours without moving, watching the door as if waiting for it to breathe. The first violent incident inside Monster Wing happened during a routine wellness check. He refused to cuff up for cell extraction, standard protocol before any door opened. Negotiators tried first. Calm voices through the slot. Offers of phone time. Medical visits. No response. When the extraction team entered in riot gear, he attacked instantly, not wildly, but strategically. Targeting joints. Going for visors. Trying to separate one officer from the stack. It took 6 staff members to restrain him. Afterward, officers reviewed the footage repeatedly. What disturbed them wasn't the violence itself. It was the precision. Like he had rehearsed combat in a room where he'd never fought before. From that day forward, staff adjusted procedures on his tier, more officers per movement, longer restraint checks, tighter surveillance review. But Monster Wing had an unspoken rule. If an inmate kept escalating, the system responded with deeper isolation. Less property. Less light. Less human contact. And as those restrictions closed in, something inside him hardened rather than broke. By the time the midnight alarm would one day sound, officers already feared opening his door. Because they knew the man inside wasn't deteriorating like the others. He was adapting. Waiting. And building toward something they couldn't yet see. By the time his restrictions reached maximum level, the inmate's world had shrunk to a concrete rectangle. No books beyond approved lists. No personal photos. Lights controlled externally. Meals passed through the same narrow slot he now watched obsessively. Officers noticed the change in atmosphere around his cell. Other inmates screamed, argued, begged for attention. His tier stayed quiet. Too quiet. During rounds, staff reported feeling watched, even when he stood motionless at the back wall. Psychological staff noted the same pattern: prolonged silence followed by sudden, calculated defiance. Then came the discovery. During a routine inspection of meal trays, an officer noticed faint scratches along the inside edge of the food port. Barely visible unless light hit it at an angle. Maintenance reviewed the slot and found microscopic metal filings embedded in the seam. Someone had been grinding metal. Slowly. Patiently. Search protocols escalated immediately. When officers conducted a controlled cell extraction, they found the weapon hidden inside the spine of a legal document binder. Sharpened metal no longer than a toothbrush, polished to a piercing point. Small enough to conceal. Strong enough to puncture protective gear if driven with force. The realization hit staff hard. He hadn't improvised it overnight. He'd been building it for months. Possibly longer. That night, administration ordered emergency monitoring, double staffing, live camera review, and restricted approach distances. But monster wing procedures required one unavoidable task: food delivery. And it was during that routine, the most ordinary moment inside the most dangerous tier, that everything detonated. Just after midnight, an officer approached his cell alone to pass the tray, following standard staggered rounds. The slot opened. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the arm shot through. Fast. Precise. The weapon drove outward in repeated thrusts, aimed at the officer's throat and face. The guard fell backward, radio skidding across the floor as the alarm erupted through the unit. Emergency teams flooded the corridor, shields raised, command shouted. Inside the cell, the inmate didn't retreat. He stood at the door, breathing slowly, weapon still in hand, waiting for the forced entry he knew would come. But what followed changed monster wing procedures nationwide. Because when the extraction team finally breached the cell, they discovered something even more disturbing than the attack itself. The weapon wasn't the only thing he had made. And it proved that isolation hadn't neutralized the threat. It had given him time to evolve it.